Right now, as you watch this video, 14 countries in Africa cannot print their own money. They cannot set their own interest rates. They cannot move their own foreign reserves without permission. And the country that holds that permission is not the African Union. It is France. This arrangement has been in place since 1945. It is written into law. It is still running today. And it has a name almost nobody in the Western world has ever heard. It is called the CFA Franc. Before we go further, understand what we are talking about in scale. 180 million people, 14 countries, a combined GDP of over $300 billion. Nations stretching from Senegal on the Atlantic coast to Chad in the heart of the continent, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, Benin, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, the Central African Republic, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Comoros, 14 sovereign nations, with one currency, designed in Paris, managed in Paris, and for decades, with reserves kept in Paris. To understand what the CFA franc means, you first need to feel what 1960 felt like. Between 1956 and 1966, 17 African nations declared independence from European colonial powers. Crowds filled the streets, flags were raised, leaders gave speeches about sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination. For ordinary Africans, this was the moment everything was supposed to change. The land was theirs again. The resources were theirs. The future was theirs. But here is what most people never learned in school. While African leaders were raising flags at independence ceremonies, French officials were already in the room next door, negotiating the terms of what came next. And what came next was not freedom. It was a contract. The CFA franc was not created at independence. It was created in 1945, 15 years before most African countries were officially free. The full name was the Franc des colonies françaises d'Afrique, the franc of the French colonies of Africa. France created this currency to manage its colonial territories after World War II, and when those territories became independent nations, France did not dissolve the currency. It renamed it. The word colonies was removed. The system stayed exactly the same. France called it monetary cooperation. The contract used a different language. Here is what that contract actually required. Every country using the CFA franc had to deposit 65% of its foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury. Not the African Union. Not a neutral central bank. The French treasury. In Paris. In exchange, France guaranteed the currency's convertibility to the French franc and later to the euro. That sounds reasonable on paper, until you ask the question nobody was supposed to ask. What happens if you want your reserves back? The answer was in the small print. You could request them. France would consider it. There was no automatic right of withdrawal. You had deposited your national wealth into someone else's vault, and the key was not yours. France called it stability. The economists who studied it called it a deposit with no withdrawal rights. The African presidents who tried to leave called it something they could not say publicly. Now here is where the story becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Because what the CFA franc created was not just a currency system. It created a pattern. And that pattern has repeated exactly every single time a leader tried to step outside it. 1958, Guinea. Sékou Touré becomes the first African leader to reject the CFA franc and vote for full independence from France. France's response was immediate. French officials left the country within weeks. They took everything: office equipment, files, medical supplies. Some accounts report they removed the light bulbs from government buildings. They poured concrete down the plumbing. They destroyed what they could not carry. Guinea was left with nothing. And then France warned other nations what happened to countries that said no. France called it a withdrawal. Guinea called it sabotage. The ledger agreed with Guinea. 1963, Togo. Sylvanus Olympio, the president of Togo, decided to create a national currency. He wanted to leave the CFA franc system. He had already printed the new notes. 3 days before the new currency was due to launch, he was assassinated. The coup was led by soldiers trained by France. The new currency was never introduced. Togo returned to the CFA Franc. France called it internal politics. The timing disagreed. 1994. The devaluation. This is the moment that defines the CFA Franc more than any other. In January 1994, France devalued the CFA Franc by 50%. Overnight, without a vote, without a referendum, without asking the 180 million people who used the currency. One morning you woke up, and your savings were worth half of what they were the night before. Prices doubled. Salaries stayed the same. Import costs surged. The decision was made in Paris. The consequences were felt in Dakar, Abidjan, Yaoundé, and Lomé. France called it necessary adjustment. The people who lived through it called it the year everything became impossible. 2011. Libya. Muammar Gaddafi had been proposing a pan-African gold-backed currency for years. A single African currency, backed by Africa's own gold reserves, that would replace both the CFA franc and the dollar in African trade. It was called the gold dinar. He had the support of several African heads of state. In 2011, NATO began airstrikes on Libya. Gaddafi was dead by October. The gold dinar was never discussed officially again. France was among the leading voices calling for intervention. 2023, the Sahel, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. 3 countries in West Africa experienced military takeovers within 2 years. All 3 announced their intention to leave the CFA franc zone. France calls the governments illegitimate. Sanctions are threatened. ECOWAS, the West African regional bloc, initially threatens military intervention. The debate is framed as a democracy crisis. But read the economic announcements from all 3 governments. The first policy statement from each new administration mentions the same thing. Currency sovereignty. France calls it instability. The 3 governments call it independence. The CFA franc is the sentence neither side says out loud. Now, here is the thing that will stay with you. In 2005, under international pressure, France agreed to reform the system. The reserve deposit requirement was reduced from 65% to 50%. African nations were given more representation on the governing board. France announced it as a new era of equal partnership. And then, in 2019, France announced another reform. The reserve requirement was abolished entirely. African nations would no longer be required to keep their reserves in Paris. The currency was even renamed. The CFA franc of West Africa became, officially, the ECO. Western newspapers covered it as the end of monetary colonialism. African economists read the actual reform document. And here is what they found. France would still guarantee the currency's convertibility, which means France still sets the monetary policy, which means France still controls the interest rate, which means the reserves moved, but the power did not. The name changed. The architecture stayed exactly the same. The most elegant prison in financial history does not need bars. It just needs to be the only institution that guarantees your currency is worth anything. Now, if you are watching from Europe or America, you might be asking why this matters to you. Here is why. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. If your country holds dollars, America effectively has leverage over your economy. If you want to understand why developing nations are desperate to diversify away from the dollar, why BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems, why there is a global push for monetary sovereignty. The CFA franc is the most extreme version of that story. It is what currency dependence looks like when it is written explicitly into law. And it is not ancient history. The 14 nations using this currency today include some of the most resource-rich territories on Earth. Ivory Coast, the world's largest cocoa producer. Gabon, significant oil reserves. Niger, one of the world's largest uranium suppliers. This is not a footnote. The uranium that powers French nuclear reactors, which generates 70% of France's electricity, comes substantially from Niger. Niger is one of the poorest countries on earth. France has some of the cheapest electricity in Europe. Those two facts share a balance sheet. And yet, for 80 years, the arrangement has been called cooperation. Here is what the CFA Franc actually teaches us. Colonialism did not end in 1960. It was restructured. Physical occupation was expensive. It required soldiers, administrators, infrastructure. Monetary control is cheap. It requires a currency guarantee, a central bank, and a contract most people never read. The flags changed. The economic architecture did not. And here is the part that is most uncomfortable. This was not hidden. The agreements were signed publicly. The reserve requirements were documented. Economists in France wrote papers about how the system worked. The information existed. The question was never whether people knew. The question was whether knowing it was enough reason to change it. For 80 years, the answer was no. And the 180 million people who used this currency woke up every morning inside a financial system designed for someone else's benefit. Not because they were weak, not because they were unaware, but because the system was built specifically to make exit as costly as independence. France didn't leave Africa in 1960. It changed its address. Mansa Musa crashed the global economy with generosity. The CFA Franc was designed, in writing, to transfer wealth in one direction. Both stories involve Africa and money. Only one of them appears in Western history textbooks. I want to ask you something before you go. If your country woke up tomorrow and discovered that 50% of its national reserves were held in a foreign government's treasury, with no automatic right to withdraw them, what would you call that arrangement? Drop your answer in the comments, because the 180 million people who lived inside it were told it had a different name. Next week, we go back to 1885. One Belgian man, one private company, one country, and the most profitable humanitarian mission in the history of capitalism. I'll see you then.